Thank you all for coming. This is going to be Web Developer's Guide to Accessibility Evaluation. When I originally envisioned the session, I thought we would go sort of deep into testing techniques, but then as I actually got to thinking about what we could do productively in 40 minutes and what I thought the most important takeaway would be, it sort of evolved into sort of a step back, more meta, higher level look at how to think about testing rather than the testing itself. If you are a web developer and you would like to get more involved in like the nuts and bolts day-to-day stuff for accessibility, you can join the Accessible Developers mailing list. If you go to accessibility.yale.edu, there's information about joining our mailing lists. There's a general list and a list specifically for developers, and if you join the developers list, I'll send you an Outlook invite to the recurring monthly meeting that we have where we just talk about accessibility once a month. We find a different topic. Those sessions tend to be pretty in-depth, so I kind of wanted to take a higher perspective in this talk. I wanted to talk about sort of why we're pitching this specifically to web developers. There are a lot of roles that need to know about accessibility. There are site owners, there's designers, there are content editors, there are web developers. And so, but I want to specifically think about what developers need and why developers should be involved. And so the way I was thinking about it is tend to think about one of the more common sort of architectural patterns at Yale. So we have this idea of like a platform, like a Yale site, like a Tridion, what have you. And then on top of that, you might have the individual site customizations. And then on top of that, you might have the specific content for the website. And if you think about where a developer might have some ability to influence the accessibility of the product, it's probably going to be at the platform and the site level. We don't necessarily want our developers to be editing WYSIWYG editors, to change bold tags to heading levels or adding alt text. That's probably not a good use of a web developer's time. It's probably a better use of a content editor's time. But so we really sort of want to think on these levels. And then as we think deeper, it's actually not fair to say that the developers are only responsible for sort of these two lower areas, because a developer can affect the content layer through a set of standards called ATAG. You may have heard of Yale's commitment to WCAG or WCAG, which lays out what it means for something to be accessible. There's a lesser known set of set of standards called ATAG, which stands for Authoring Tools Accessibility Guidelines. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but in short, what ATAG means is that when you build a site, the tools that you give to your content editors should facilitate those content editors in being able to produce accessible content. So if I give you a WYSIWYG editor because you're a content editor, and I let you change the font color to anything you want, you could change the font color to like a light gray and a white background. I haven't done my job as a developer in giving you the tools you need to sort of do, to create an accessible product. I should take away the functionality to let you choose the color of your font, because that'll help you create a more accessible product. Or if I'm letting you upload an image, I should decide whether or not to allow you to upload alt text for that image, or even if I should require you to do alt text on that image. So those are the ways that the developers can sort of influence the content layer, even if they're not directly responsible for it. So I think developers just have a larger sphere of influence than sort of other roles when it comes to accessibility. So you know, that's sort of, in thinking about this, that's why I sort of specifically wanted to tailor things. ITS does offer training to content editors. If you are interested in that content training, go to the accessibility website and sign up for that. We don't have anything for visual designers just yet, but I'm sure that's going to come down the pike in the coming months. But so I just want to think about sort of why we're targeting developers in this talk. And when I thought about what developers do on projects, I came up with a list, and I'll sort of list the major things I think developers do in sort of a list from least to most controversial. So we'll start out with the things that I don't think many people will object to. Developers implement designs and functionality. I don't think that's a very controversial statement. Developers research solutions. I think that's still probably not that controversial. Developers negotiate designs and functionality. I think that's a bit of a controversial statement. If a visual designer gives me a design and I know that that design is going to be difficult to implement, or if I know that that design is going to be expensive to implement, I should probably try to negotiate with the designer or with the project owner, things like that. Some developers may not necessarily see that as their role, but I think the more that developers can do that, it's probably a smart thing. Developers enforce policy. I think this is probably going to be a quite controversial statement, but when you think about what I hope that developers do when they are given a requirement or when they're given a specification that violates some Yale policy, either they're being asked to implement something that's not accessible, or they're being asked to implement something that violates some sort of security requirements, it's my hope that the developer simply refuses to implement the thing, even though that's the requirement they're given. I hope that what developer would say, no, I'm not going to build that because building that violates a policy that we're governed by. Do that diplomatically, of course, but still sort of drawing a line on that policy, and then sort of educating other project members about what accessibility is, what security is, what policy is. If you give me a design and maybe I can, educate you about what's difficult or what's easy, then that can maybe lead to a better product. Sort of these later things require sort of a much more active developer. It means a developer has to think of themselves as not necessarily being a coder, but sort of more of an important stakeholder in the project's success. And sort of it's in these later areas that the more a developer knows about accessibility, the better. And when we think about accessibility evaluation, I want to draw a distinction between evaluation and testing. When I think of testing, I think of accessibility testing as you have your product and you are making sure that the product works. When I think of accessibility evaluation, I think sort of assessing how accessible the project is likely to be through the life cycle of the project. It's one thing to take a piece of code that's not accessible and make it accessible. It's another thing to look at a visual design and to suggest changes to that visual design that'll make it more accessible. It's another thing to be involved in the initial sort of discovery process when clients are giving all of the features they want, and a developer can raise their hand and say, that feature you're asking for, that's not very accessible, maybe there's an alternative. So negotiating things even earlier in the project is something that a developer can do. So you can think about, would you rather design something, have it approved, build it, find out it's not accessible, redesign it and rebuild it? We've had a lot of this happening since the Yale policy was adopted. Would you rather design something, have it approved, find out it's inaccessible, redesign it, and then build it so you don't rebuild it? So to move from the first and the second, it requires a bit earlier of intervention for someone who's responsible for accessibility? Or would you rather design something, find out it's inaccessible, redesign it, have it approved, and build it if you sort of get the intervention even earlier before the approval? Or would you rather learn what's accessible, design it, have it approved, and then build it? The last of these is probably the cheapest. It involves the least frustration. And I really do believe that the way that we get to sort of these final so outcomes sort of toward the bottom of this list and away from the top is by getting sort of developers involved earlier. Obviously, like designers should know about accessibility requirements, developers should know about accessibility requirements, the accessibility team should, but there are very few of us that we can't get involved in every project, so we hope that developers can take responsibility for some of this themselves. It's also commonly the case at Yale that a developer will get a project and there aren't any visual designs. They just say, I want it to do these things, go build it. So a developer really, at Yale, developers probably have to be the people who sort of take the lead in understanding what these criteria are. Even if it's not ideal, it's probably the reality we live in. So I think I've made my case for why it's important for developers to know about accessibility and to be involved early to create accessible products. So the most common question we get is my site accessible? You're persuaded that accessibility is important. It's something that you care about. Now you want to know whether it's accessible. This is the most common question that the accessibility team gets. And it's also our least favorite question. And to explain why it's our least favorite question, I will appeal to sort of an early 2000s political leader, Donald Rumsfeld, who made a comment that I'm going to sort of appropriate for my purposes. There are no knowns, there are things we know. We also know that there are knowns unknowns. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, This is most of accessibility involved, we're in the unknown unknowns area. Developers, project owners, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know whether their thing is accessible or not. And having these accessibility requirements is great because it's a standard we should be meeting, but you tell people your product should be accessible, and they say, I don't even know where to begin. And so that's sort of, this is sort of always my reaction whenever, this is always a developer's reaction when they find out that they have to do accessibility, and then it's sort of my response. I looked for other quotes from Bush era figures, and this is sort of the one that I thought was most appropriate. So accessibility evaluation is the way to make those unknown unknowns into known knowns, and I'm not going to repeat that phrase anymore because I'll trip over it. So when people discover accessibility, they say, okay, I need an automatic scanner, I need a checklist, I need things like that, because I need to know how to test for things. And this is sort of a very common mindset when you're first starting. I want to know how to test. The argument that I'm going to make here is that it's actually a more mature, higher level approach to think about what to test instead of how to test. And so the difference between these two things, for how to test, you might say, what automated tool should I be using? What can be tested automatically versus manually? What checklist should I use? When should I ask for manual review? These are all questions for, like, how do I discover my issues? And they're very nuts and bolts, they're very tactical, they're very in the weeds. I think what to test is sort of a more holistic, a more integrated way of thinking about it. So if you're thinking about what to test, you could say, can users navigate to each part of the page? Are my JavaScript-driven interactions accessible? Is my content and multimedia accessible? Are my visual designs usable for people with color blindness? And what we can see with these the kinds of questions I'm raising at the bottom is the how to test answers are varied. For can users navigate to each part of my page, some of those tests can be automatic, some of those tests can be manual, some of those tests can be user testing. Rather than try to find the perfect methodology, we should be trying to sort of mix and match methodologies based on the particular question we're asking. So having an idea about the how to test, having an idea about the techniques for testing, but also having an idea of when to use which kind of techniques based on the kinds of questions you're answering, I think is more helpful. So I'll briefly go over how to test, but then I want to really dig into sort of what to test. There are 4 basic ways of thinking about testing. The first is automated testing. Most people, when they first hear of accessibility, they think accessibility is a scan that they can run, and there are accessibility scanners. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Some common ones are WebAx and SiteImprove and Lighthouse and Wave. But there's Compliance Sheriff, there's HTML Code Sniffer, there's dozens and dozens. And there are a lot of sort of discussions, debates about which accessibility automatic scanner is the best. They're all basically the same. They're all going to catch about the same number of issues. Most importantly, none of these will catch most of the issues or even half of the issues. So I recommend that people pick the accessible scanning tool, which they sort of have the most comfort with, that they like the UI the most, and just kind of use that. And the reason for that is there's sort of 2 ways of sort of thinking about this. If you just use a scanner, it's going to spit out a list of issues. That list is not going to be terribly well organized. You're going to have to put in the effort to sort of organize the issues yourself. It's a very difficult and tedious process, and there's not really any automated scanning tool that presents issues in a friendly way. So, you know, a better solution I would recommend is like know which kinds of things respond well to automated testing, and when you get ready to test those things, turn your automated scanner on. My workflow when I started doing accessibility work, my workflow used to be turn on the automatic scanner, look at the issues, and then go. My workflow now is I sort of figure out which aspect of the page I want to test. Sort of like, say, I look at the headings. I know that automated scanners are good at headings, so I turn the automated scanner on, and I ignore most of the output, and I just look at the headings, and I say that's great. And then I turn the automatic scanner off, and I go throughout my testing process. An hour later, I get to colors. I know that automated scanners are great for colors, so I fire it back up. I ignore most of the output, and I just look at the color information. I look at that part of the report. It's great. I turn it off. It's a move from firing it once and downloading the report versus turning it off and on and only sort of selecting the kinds of output you want. But so that's sort of our introduction to automated testing. Limitation of our automated testing, I have two sort of insights from industry experts. One is Carl Groves, who's been sort of one of the leaders in accessibility testing for over a decade. Carl Groves estimates that 25% of WCAG single A criteria and 17% of WCAG double A criteria have been tested or are able to be automatically tested. And then, 29% of single A and 31% of double A criteria can be automatically tested but require manual verification. Which leaves about 46% of single A and 41% of double A that have to be manually tested, without any manual and automated tools don't help at all. So regardless of so the reason I say that like your automatic tool doesn't matter that much is because so much has to be validated manually that, we're arguing about the benefits of maybe a percentage or two. So it's the benefits aren't that great. Accessibility validation requires a lot more than just automated testing. Glenda Sims is a consultant at DQ. She sort of did a survey of her testers, and she found that most testers spend about 38% of time with testing tools. So that means a combination of automatic testing and automatic testing with manual verification. So 38% of the time on an evaluation is with testing tools. 30% of the time is spent with a screen reader. 10% of time testing is spent with a keyboard alone, and then sort of the remaining 22% of time is spent writing reports. So even if so automated testing, best case scenario, you're going to spend less than 40% of your total time using sort of automated tools. And sort of what Glenda found at DQ is that their testers spend about 3 hours per page. So the amount of time you're going to be spending using an automated tool versus a manual tool, probably only an hour of your effort on a 3-hour page. Additional hows of assessing. You can assess with assistive technology, so screen readers, keyboard only, mobile devices, and voice control if you want to get really fancy. We're not doing a lot of voice control testing over in ITS, but one day we might get there. A third way of testing is sort of code inspection, which basically just means inspecting your rendered markup and if you know the things to look for. This is where I spend most of my time on accessibility testing, is just looking at the DOM at the time that it's rendered. And you have to know the things to look for, but sort of that's the methodology. And then sort of the fourth most common way of testing is with user testing. So you grab users. It's best to use the same tasks that you would use in your normal user testing. User testing with people with disabilities is not about asking them to find the things that don't work. It's about asking them to go through the same tasks that any user would go through and then sort of seeing what happens. It can be extremely difficult logistically because when you're doing user testing, most often you like people to use the device you provide, but people with disabilities often like to use their own devices, and that can create a lot of issues around screen capture. Maybe they have interesting configurations. Maybe you don't have access to that technology to replicate those issues. Screen capture can be difficult. Getting a range of people with various impairments can be difficult for user testing. It's just sort of an expensive sort of task. So that's sort of my quick whirlwind about sort of the hows of user testing. But I sort of want to transition from the hows to the what. So the downsides of thinking about how is that your findings might not be logically organized. If you just get an automatic report, the report is not going to be strong enough to know whether the defect exists in the content or in the template or in the JavaScript or what layer you're on. It's just going to give you a big list of all of the issues, and you have to spend your own time sort of sifting through that. You can miss the forest for the trees. Your accessibility report, you go through your checklist, you go through your automatic scanner, you find you have 10 images that don't have alt text. But you might not think about whether those images need alt text or why the images need alt text. The report just tells you to add alt text, but maybe the correct solution is to remove the image altogether. Maybe it's a false positive, no alt text is needed. So you can kind of lose the forest for the trees when you just think about your techniques. It's reactive rather than proactive. You can only use a lot of tests on an implemented piece of HTML. You can't run an automatic scan on a Photoshop mockup. You can't run an automatic scan on a wireframe, things like that. And it can really only be done toward the end of a project when you actually have something to test. When you transition from thinking about the how to test to the what to test, you think about more holistic thinking. If you're thinking, so while you can't run an automatic scanner, or you can't do a user test, or you can't do a code inspection on a Photoshop mockup, you can sort of think, what is the heading structure going to be of this page? What is the landmark structure going to be in this page? What are the keyboard interactions that I need to plan for? I don't necessarily need a JavaScript widget that's built in order to think through the accessibility implications of the keyboard interaction. It can lead to better designs because you're getting those implementations early. You're seeing you're not missing the forest for the trees, and it sort of this sort of what thinking leads to promoting better interventions throughout the project. A developer can raise their hand and they can sort of object to a design decision earlier rather than later. So for example, if we have the Yale News website, this is a screenshot I grabbed from them. If I run my automatic scan, or if I go through my checklist, it might tell me that there are 2 images that don't have alt text. And my automatic scanner just flags them. It can't tell me whether the image is a part of the template or a part of the content. In this case, the lower image from the brain would probably be something you upload into the WYSIWYG. It's probably part of the content. The menu button is actually something that's going to be coming from a template. So if you just have your automatic scan, someone has to go through and triage these issues and say, okay, this is your responsibility, this is your responsibility, things like that. Whenever I do content editor training, one thing my content editors ask for is always, can you show me the automatic scanner to check some of this stuff? Because everything that a content editor might mess up can probably get caught by an automatic scan. Headers not working, alt text missing, things like that. And I always tell them, no, I'm not going to give them the automatic scan, because the automatic scan will find everything on the page, including things that they can't influence themselves, like things from the content, or like things from the template. And for content, it's fast enough just to eyeball things. We don't really need an automatic scanner. But so our checklist or our automatic scan might not be able to make the distinction between the 2 images, whereas the resolution, for like the design and the resolution are very different processes to fix the brain and the menu button, even though the violation is the same. Likewise, if we just want to look at the button, there are oftentimes when you do an automatic test, or when you do an automated test, or when you go through a checklist, it will organize your issues according to WCAG criteria. So if you've ever seen an audit report, it'll give you maybe 100 rows of issues or 150 rows of issues, and it's organized by criteria type. So the issues with the button will be scattered all over your report. It can be confusing to sort of be like, if you ask the question, what are all of the problems with my button, and you just run through a checklist or you run through an automated scanner, you won't really get all of those issues in one place, where if you're thinking about the methodology. But if you're thinking about the button, then you can sort of approach it more holistically, and you can think, and you can, gather all of your issues in one place. I've seen the automated reports where like this, a button like this might have 10 different issues, but it's hard to find all 10 because you have to scan a long Excel spreadsheet. It's just not helpful. But you're going to get a disorganized report if you're focused on the how, but not necessarily on the what. Some examples of this kind of what to test thinking instead of how to test thinking. You think about navigating within a page. This is mostly headings and landmarks, skip links, things like that. Complex interaction, JavaScript widgets, things like that. Keyboard operability, and even user-generated content. So I want to go briefly through a few potential examples. Let's say that I am a developer and my visual designer, so I'm a developer, and see, these are the ways that I can intervene. Before design begins, if I'm a developer included on a project, I can begin expressing concerns about the client's wish list from the initial conversation. I don't have to wait until design is done and they say, okay, build it. I can actually object to some of the things that they're asking for in the beginning. During design, I can look at the design and I can, negotiate changes and point out best practices. And then during development, I can use my code inspection or my assistive technology, so on and so forth. So maybe a visual designer gives me an example of a widget like this. An automated scanner is not really going to find problems with a widget like this, but if I'm thinking in terms of I want my widget to be accessible rather than let me go through my checklist, I might be able to negotiate a change and add sort of some keyboard-only buttons to be able to sort of move things, because like maybe my designer was thinking about a drag and drop, and because I think about complex interactions and generally I can know that I also need to add buttons. So that's a change I can negotiate early in the design phase or even in the wireframes before the designs are included. Or if I'm thinking about navigation within a page, I can encourage my designers to think of a strong information architecture, because a strong information architecture leads to page layouts that are easier to code for accessibility. I can negotiate with developers to implement more consistent layouts. If I'm thinking sort of more holistically. And sort of during and after development, I can sort of pick the testing approaches that I need. So let's say that a developer or a designer gives me 2 wireframes or 2 mock-ups that have some kind of filters. Sometimes the filters are above the result, sometimes the filters are in the sidebar. These are fine, these pass all of the WCAG criteria, but if I'm thinking in terms of what's going to be the most efficient sort of page structure, then maybe I can negotiate a point where we lay all of our sort of pages like this out in one way or the other. So rather than having 2 different layouts, we just kind of have one layout. But that sort of involves a shift from thinking of what tool do I use to how do I facilitate the best design. Some caveats about this kind of thinking. The how approach is appropriate for things like institutional metrics. For better or for worse, we're getting a giant scanner that we will point at all of the Yale websites because we can't validate every web page at Yale manually. We have to do some automated stuff. And so if we want to try to get a big sample, we have to sort of use that big automated scanner. If we think about thinking about the what to evaluate, sort of requires some more judgment and experience. And thinking about the how is a good beginner approach. If you've never done accessibility, find a checklist, find an automated scanner, and get started then. And then as you get more experience, things stop appearing as a list of discrete issues, and they start appearing as sort of more integrated wholes. And then in order to really find out all of your unknown unknowns, you probably do need an exhaustive checklist. We do have a pretty exhaustive checklist on the accessibility website, and that's more of a how approach than a what approach, but it is something that we can, so it is still something that we need. So in conclusion, thinking about it, it's really more about designing. Developers should sort of have a hand in sort of like crafting experiences. When we're wedded to our tools and when we're obsessed with our methodologies and when we're obsessed with our testing protocols, we sort of kind of miss the forest for the trees. Whereas when we focus on, we want to shift our focus from my automated scanner gives me a list of my headings to what is the appropriate heading structure for the page. We want to move from our images don't have alt text to do our images need alt text? Should we replace the image with something else? Should we replace the image with a button? Things like that. These kinds of more holistic thinkings can sort of promote a more a more integrated whole. It's the kind, whenever we do our developer training as part of our monthly brown bags, some of the techniques that I teach, it's a combination of automatic and manual testing. It's a combination of, manual testing and using a checklist. It's a combination of all those kinds of things. But, accessibility testing, finding accessibility issues, there's so many moving parts. You kind of have to have a view of the bigger picture while you're doing the assessment, or else the assessment will just feel like a maddening, never-ending sort of list of issues. I would encourage anyone who's interested and who has a developer role to sort of sign up for our list and to sort of come to our monthly meetings, because those do get sort of more the nitty-gritty kinds of testing techniques.